Misconfigurations are responsible for almost 70% of major outages, costing enterprises billions in downtime. My name is Paul Nashawaty, and I'm the practice lead for the app dev practice at theCUBE Research. And today I'm joined by Alexis, Brian, and Jesper from ConfigHub. Hi guys, how you doing?
Hey, Paul.
Good to have you on. It's awesome to see you again. Why don't we give a little bit of introduction? You want to start, Alexis? Why don't we start with you?
I'm Alexis. You might know me from my last company, Weaveworks, creators of GitOps, or from working on the CNCF with Brian, where I was chair of the TOC. Long time ago, I created something called RabbitMQ, which was very successful, as a result of which I was held hostage by VMware for 4 years when I worked on Spring.
Thank you, Alexis. Brian, how about you?
Yeah, hi, I'm Brian Grant. I was at Google for a long time, and I was part of the team there that created Kubernetes. While I worked on Kubernetes, I developed a core declarative model and how Kubernetes is commonly configured, like kube control, apply, customize, and the tooling around that.
Very cool, very cool. And Jesper, how about you?
Everyone, nice to be here. Jesper Joergensen. I spent a lot of time at Salesforce, but more specifically Heroku. As part of doing the acquisition, I was there from the beginning. That's how I bumped into Alexis when we were doing partnerships around RabbitMQ and build packs and many other things. And that's also what built my passion for developer tooling, especially in the cloud. And we've now decided to join forces here in ConfigHub.
There's a lot of tribal knowledge here for sure. You all bring a wealth of knowledge from your backgrounds, and when we look at today's cloud native world, configuration is both a critical enabler, but it's also a hidden risk. And system scale and diversity, misconfigurations really have become the leading cause for outages and compliance failures and deployment delays. So, I think when we start about this conversation, Brian, I guess I could start with you. When we look at misconfigurations, right? It's not always the top thing. It's sometimes it's blamed for nearly 70% of major outages. But like when we think about it, how can somebody prevent and and recover from these incidents more effectively?
Yeah, I think there are really a lot of sources for why misconfigurations happen, but one of the biggest contributors is that the configuration is extremely complex, and it's complex in a few different ways. One way in which it's complex is the representation is super complex. So tools like Helm and Terraform, for example, they generate configuration data on the fly. They have fairly complex syntaxes with complex packages of configuration built up on top of that. And it's not really obvious at all what configurations are going to be applied to the systems under management, whether it's Kubernetes or cloud resources. That makes it more likely that unexpected configurations will result from those configurations operations. And I still hear all the time that the reason operations people kind of break glass and go bypass configuration mechanisms and go update systems directly is because that's perceived to be lower risk. Certainly it's faster, and certainly it's simpler, and the means of making the change is much less complicated. In terms of risk, it's actually a trade-off because they don't have as many safeguards in place when they make changes directly to the systems. But yet it's still perceived, to be safer to just use a cloud console, for example, than to make a change through Terraform, or to make a change, with kube control directly to Kubernetes, rather than making a change to a Helm chart, which might take, potentially hours or days to work out. What are the implications of the change? What different environments might be affected? What teams might be affected? Because typically the configurations aren't self-contained. They actually are shared configurations that affect many different applications of that same configuration code effectively.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. But when we think about it, I think, Alexis, we were talking about some of these different things earlier when we were having dinner one night. We were talking about how configurations misconfigurations are usually kind of what you see in the headlines and news and such, but it's really not always about that. What is it about?
It's a lot of it is about delays, and we spoke to a very well-known platform as a service company when we were setting up this operation, and they told us that probably about 80% of their delays are caused by misconfiguration. That is to say, a rollout has got stuck, or a test isn't working the way we wanted it to, or we're pushing a change and something's gone wrong, or customers are complaining, and it's a misconfiguration has happened. We've got to go back and trace where it started and find out who made that change, when did they make it, why did they make it, which line of which file was impacted. Maybe there's multiple files, multiple lines. Build a picture of what happened in the past in order to change it back to what it should be. And that requires a different approach to solve, because you want to say, okay, let's keep a record of those changes so we know what happened, and we can then have a way to fix it and bring us back to the correct path.
So yes, but do you agree with this? I mean, is there a different way would you think about when you look at misconfigurations? Is it always up to the client or the organization's fault, or are they tripping over themselves? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think a lot of people would agree with what we're sitting here and talking about. A lot of people that we have learned together within the industry over the last 10, 15 years have gone from making these mistakes and using, like Brian said, being in a cloud console, for example, and having to fix something and then running into trouble. And a good chunk of those have, over the last many years, tried to address those problems by ratcheting down, by using infrastructure as code, by creating pipelines of input value files, template files, scripts that operate on those template files to generate, kind of the next stage and the next stage and the next stage of the pipeline. And they've done all that in order to reduce the amount of errors. But instead, a lot of us find ourselves backed into a corner now of having created something that becomes more scary to change, because now some of the changes that we're making can actually affect many more different aspects of the system, because we've entangled it via all these scripts. And we've also made it way harder to go from observing a problem in the live infrastructure and going back to fixing it, because it's not clear where the fix needs to be applied, because we've created essentially a Rube Goldberg machine that produces the config that is eventually applied.
Yeah, and that kind of ties back to where you have a modern environment that often relies on messy mix of like YAML files, Helm charts, and scripts across multiple clouds. So Alexis, I want to kind of come back to you on this, because we were talking a little bit about that to reduce that configuration drift and the chaos that organizations run into. Sometimes preventative is actually the way to go versus like reacting after something happens. Would you agree to that?
I would. I think, though, I would first of all point to an industry trend, which is to use, no-code or low-code approaches, platforms and portals, things like Backstage, to guide developers down a path, which then people talk about golden paths or guardrails, or they're expecting people to fill out a limited amount of information so that the system can do the rest. That concept is kind of the right thing. However, what we've noticed is the majority of large organizations are not willing to be within those constraints. Every time you have a golden template, somebody wants to break it. The AI team wants to roll things out much more quickly, so they make changes to the guardrails. That's fine if you can capture those changes and keep them somewhere. So our approach involves thinking about this as a database problem and making sure that all the changes are kept in different, essentially rows of a database, so they can be, mapped against the logs, as I mentioned before, and correctly verified against the running system in order to prevent drift.
Yeah, I like that. And cataloging this into a system that you can actually track and look at. Brian, when we look at it in the context of this chaos and reducing configuration drift, and what Alexis was talking about with this catalog, how does that really help with say heritage systems moving to new systems? If somebody's looking from a heritage environment, they're looking to move to a new system, is that an easy lift, or is it a hard thing to kind of overcome?
I think there's a couple of different steps. I mean, if they want to migrate their existing configuration to a different way of managing that configuration, like ConfigHub, that is definitely doable, and we intend to provide a lot of help with that. I think you can get immediate benefits by doing something like that, by taking advantage of some continuous validation that we do of configuration. Most configuration formats have some kind of schema, or at least documentation, which describes what a valid configuration looks like. And that can be used to automatically validate the configuration, because we're representing the configuration in a simple data format, which is really amenable to this validation. So instead of pushing a complicated template through a pipeline and waiting for it to be generated and rendered to the point where you could validate it, we can just validate immediately after every change. If you need to convert one system to a different system, like if you're running on VMs and you want to migrate to Kubernetes, I mean, that's a very different problem. And depending on how you're running your application, I think there may be some new tools becoming available that would help with that migration, but I think that's still going to be challenging.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, I think when you look at it, Jesper, I'm going to come to you with this question, because I think when we think about this from a developer's perspective, many developers are really hesitant to touch configurations late in the release cycle because of exactly what Brian's talking about, which is they're risking of breaking something as they're going along. And when we think about this, how can they be reassured that getting into the CI/CD pipeline to make the configuration safer and more agile is really the best approach to do this without introducing those breaks that happen? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, that goes back to kind of the maybe slightly wrong turn we've been taking recently, where we're trying to compensate for the dangers of going directly into live consoles and like touching them in there. That obviously can be pretty scary when you go into, say, AWS console and you go to VPC configuration and you're editing it directly. But we've jumped from there all the way to the other side, where we put a bunch of tooling in place and often running it in a CI/CD pipeline, where it gets scary for different reasons. It gets scary because it has much larger blast radius. You say you have a CI/CD system that is powered by a bunch of scripts plus a bunch of config that maybe manages your dev, staging, and prod network. And you need to fix something, and maybe it requires a fix to the script, not just the data. And that can impact all three networks if you do it the wrong way. So this is where we feel like people have jumped over the middle, and the middle is what we call a missing database for config, where config can exist in its literal form, as we say, meaning that you read it from top to bottom and you can understand everything. There's no variables, no like coding constructs or anything in there, but it's not in the live system, right? It's in a database, and you get to actually look at it, you get to change it, you get to have reviews of your changes before it goes live. And so that creates that safety and clarity that developers are missing with the tools they have today.
Yeah, that absolutely. And I think the one thing I want to add to that, though, is when there's increasing pressures around, meet compliance and security standards, you really need to have a better way to kind of governance and have auditability around those configuration changes. And Alexis, I want to come back to you, because you were talking about this. It's like those changes have to occur, but they have to be done in an orchestrated way. And this is different than a lot of traditional ways of doing it, right? It's like usually it's, this compliance and regulation kind of goes into play, but it's kind of like appended to the pipeline, not kind of rolled into it. What are your thoughts on adding that in kind of more in ahead of the release cycle than after?
I don't know about ahead or after, but I will say that currently we have two constituencies in the enterprise: a group of developers or DevOps people who are used to generating changes in code and then config, storing them in Git, and then having triggers that load pipelines that generate more things like infrastructure as code changes that load into production. And That doesn't always work, and it can be quite slow to work with when there is an outage or a delay or some other problem that you need to fix. You know, you're trying to get the website back up, and your YAML is just all around your eyeballs. You don't know what to look at. Then there's this other constituency of operations people who used to be in charge, but they sort of got pushed out of the loop by developers about 15 years ago. And we really want to bring these two ways of working back together. So on the one hand, what the operations people want to do is what we call click ops, which is when they make changes to operations by clicking a screen. And the advantage of this is I can see the state. It's like fixing a router at home. I can make a change myself, and then I can immediately see the results. Meanwhile, I, in particular, and to some extent some of my colleagues, have been preaching GitOps to developers and DevOps people for the last 5 or 7 years, where you can achieve operational changes by the DevTool changes. So I make a change, I store it in Git, and then I use DevTools to apply that to my running system. And that has a lot of benefits too, but the ops teams hate it because they don't want to use the DevTools. And it can be something that can be a little slow if you've got a lot of approvals in that pipeline. Meanwhile, the dev people don't necessarily want to use the ops tools either. In our approach, we're going to bring these together. You will be able to make changes from the sort of the dev side and from the ops side in a way that everybody can be part of solving the problem, which I think is going to reduce a lot of the frictions, delays, misconfigurations, risks, and outages that we see today. And actually, there are other stakeholders we haven't even mentioned, like security, who can be part of it too.
Right. Yeah, no, and this is one of the reasons why I really thought it would be great to have you on this podcast, because my audience here that watches is really in tune to what's happening, and they're thinking of a new way, the new way of doing this, and having that, you know, working together with the groups and the organizations within the company to make sure they have everything delivered appropriately. But, you know, everyone's rowing to that same kind of direction, right? Everyone's moving to that same SLO, and they're moving to the same focus. And that's a new kind of different. It's not siloed like it was previously in previous deployments. But as we're coming to the end, we talked a lot about different configurations, and the three of you, as I mentioned, there's a lot of wisdom here that you bring to the table. You come from various backgrounds and they have a lot of experience. As we kind of close out, I'd love to give you each a closing thought here. Maybe to tell the audience what would you advise to them? Where would they go to learn more about how, to get started if they're trying to change their ways or trying to learn more about their ways or a different model? And Brian, let's start with you.
Yeah, over the past year, I've been writing a lot on my blog on Medium about challenges that I see people having with the infrastructure as code patterns that have been developed and evolved over the past 3 decades, really my entire career. And I think, I haven't written too much about the solution yet because we haven't made it available. But, if any of those challenges resonate with folks, or sometimes people are kind of desensitized to the toil and complexity that they experience day in and day out, then that can sort of help them think about, well, where their challenges really are and what the most impact would be in terms of changing how they're doing things now. And that's really the first step, is understanding that you have a problem and where the problem is. And then, then you can, after that, you can start thinking about, well, what would a possible improvement be to our current process?
Yeah, that makes sense, Brian. Thank you. Jesper, what are your thoughts?
Well, we all know that, once you have like a team or a couple of teams that set up, you set up some tooling, things are beginning to work for you, you may be frustrated. It can be hard to stop and, try to fix the tooling part. We understand that it can be a lot to ask for people to go and change things. But what we've observed out there is that, a lot of people start with what we call click ops, right? You want your first thing up and running. You shouldn't really bother with writing scripts or tooling or anything like that. So you do that for a little bit, and eventually that becomes hard to manage. And then you start considering tools like ISE. You may start reading all the blogs out there, start evaluating all the tools. That's certainly where I would really ask that you come check us out, ConfigHub.com, contact us form, and we'll respond, because before you really go and invest yourself in a big stack or that really we think is going to hit a brick wall eventually, then you should at least come and hear what we have to say and see what can be done differently. And then we also think there's another group out there, and we're already talking to some of them, who are really frustrated with their IAC tooling, who are feeling all the pain, who are trying to upgrade Helm charts and it doesn't work the way they expect to, who are trying to come up with good delegation patterns between platform teams and app teams, and they're really struggling with it. And we think those people probably have a lot of battle scars that we can kind of look at together, and would benefit from hearing like how we think that this can be done in a better way.
Yeah, I think that's wise advice. I think that's really, really great. Alexis, final word.
I actually think Jesper said it incredibly well. If you're a VP of platform or a team lead or a CIO or a CISO, and you're worried about delays or risks associated with the wrong YAML, or you've heard that Helm gets it wrong sometimes, or Terraform is complicated, or we don't know what HashiCorp is going to do with Terraform because of IBM, all of that stuff, we call that config hell. If you want to get out of config hell, talk to us. There's a form on our website, or you can email hello@confighub.com. And I would like to finish by saying, maybe one will be one day say configuration can be fun. At the moment, it kind of isn't, but I hope it will be eventually.
Well, I like that. I mean, I'm sure that, nobody wants to, dread their job, and configuration can be fun. But thank you all for being on. I really had, enjoyed you having on the show today. This has been great. A big thank you for all of you that tuned in. We really do appreciate you being part of the AppDevANGLE community. Well, that wraps up this episode, and we'll be back next Wednesday with another conversation diving into the tools, trends, and talent shaping the future of application development. Whether you're deploying at the edge, building with AI, or modernizing your cloud stack, we've got you covered. Be sure to follow us on social. If you have any other thoughts, questions, or just want to connect, you can always reach me at pauln@siliconangle.com. Until next time, stay curious and stay building. Thank you.